Let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation then, because there's a lot to unpack here, and it's a little bit complicated. Like in so many ways, I feel like this is one of the most ambitious episodes that we've done, because even after spending hours like researching and getting ready, I think I pitched this idea to you back like 2 or 3 months ago, hoping that I would be like prepared and I would understand these concepts. And yet here I am on the night of the show, and I'm honestly still kind of struggling with how do you define neuroqueering? Can you help me out at all here?
I can try. It's
Sure.
one of those subjects that is enormously huge, so it's hard to put into succinct terms. And is it Professor Walker that coined the term. Even he says that it's not really a term that you can put an authoritative, like succinct definition for, but it's roughly how like neurodivergent experiences and identities intersect with other parts of our identities, such as sexuality or gender, because a lot of these things are social, and the way that people with different neuro diversity experience the world is often a little socially offbeat.
Sure. Yeah.
So, those things kind of like tie in together and make this wonderful double rainbow.
No, that's a good way of putting it. For a lot of folks listening, there are probably a couple of terms that we should hit on really quickly. One of them you've already used here, which is neurodivergent. Can you just very briefly walk us through what that refers to?
Right. So neurodiversity was a term coined by Judy Singer in '98, and it's basically taking like certain things like developmental differences, such as like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, and rather than like categorizing it as a like through the deficit or medical paradigm, seeing it more as like a different expression of like the human genome. So like we have different brains the same way we have different hair, and there's no one right type of brain.
Yeah, we're going to be returning to that idea a lot tonight, because I think that's like pretty baked into why the term neuroqueering may be useful. But I guess the other half of it is queer, which is a word that I know makes my dad very uncomfortable, and a lot of people still feel challenged by it. And I want to be respectful to that, because I know that that's a term that has been used as a slur. I know a lot of people have had literal rocks thrown at them, and have been assaulted while hearing that word attached to the reason for the violence. But I guess for our purposes, queer is just anything that is outside of your cisgendered, hetero, typical, conventionally presenting sexuality. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, and then so I guess heteronormativity is that notion of pressuring people to be what? To be within certain confines?
Right, like the expectation that the default is always heterosexual unless something outside of that signifies. And also like the expectation is going to be that way. Like everyone's brought up with the well, sometimes boys notice girls, and the world is a lot wider.
Mm, fair to say. Well, neuronormativity may be a new term for some people, but we're building off of these same ideas. What can you say about that?
Again, like there's a lot of expectation that all people are going to be neurotypical, which is the what would have been the right brain under the deficit paradigm, and people expect, well, like this things that go with it, like autistic. I'm autistic myself, so have like communication differences that sometimes people misunderstand because they don't understand like the way I communicate, or maybe like I present differently. Like I stim a lot with my hands, and people are not used to seeing that, so that can like make people feel uncomfortable. And there's also often like a lot of pressure to like stamp these differences out of people. So
Sure.
even if you're autistic, you're still supposed to present as neurotypical when you're out in the world. And there's a lot of therapies and therapies that
Yeah.
go into making, like neurodivergent people seem indistinguishable from their peers.
Fair to say. Well, and then I guess one last term that's going to be useful tonight is intersectionality, because that's really what we're talking about here is the intersection of queer and neurodivergent. I mean, is that fair?
Right. Yes. And at least like to me, intersectionality is like no one's just one thing, and we've all got these like different facets to ourselves, and all of these things play into our experiences, and it's how those things all like mesh together to create, our unique experiences.
Yeah, so I guess if we take all of that and blend it together, we get something approaching like a functional definition for neuroqueering. I mean, what kind of picture do you get when we think about neuroqueering as a verb, as like the act of neuroqueering? I mean, how do you interpret that?
That to me, I tend to think of first in terms of like activist spaces, people, basically trying to disrupt the idea of, heteronormity or cisnormity or any other kind of normity, all of them. And sometimes that can be through like advocacy or, like teaching people about these different experiences, because hopefully if people understand them, they can empathize with them. And if they empathize with you, they're less likely to demonize you,
Sure.
and everyone is set free. And also like, it's often used for like art, performance art, um, like literature, any basically if a human can do it, you can neuroqueer it.
Yeah, I like that notion because I have been kind of wrestling with my own neurodivergent diagnosis and identity in this past year and trying to figure out what that means to me. And when we talk about masking and we talk about like neuronormativity and these different concepts, there's a certain sense of like putting on your Sunday best. You know, it reminds me so much of those ideas of like visiting grandma's house and being on your best behavior and going to a nice restaurant and having to follow the rules and these different things. And so I almost see neuroqueering as maybe the opposite of that. It's like you're still being well behaved, but you're being yourself in like an active and intentional way. I mean, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I think so. And I remember when I was on last time, I was talking about like masking as an autistic person, and like be brought up, talking about similar experiences when you get into things like, non-binary identities or trans identities. Like, there's the expectation that people are going to present and be a certain way, and sometimes for safety or self-preservation, um, we kind of put these faces on, and it's like being an actor in your own life rather than living it.
Hmm.
um, and I think that's like one of the most toxic parts of things like neuronormativity and, all the other normativities we mentioned is, in order to like fly under the radar, you have to kind of contort yourself into an identity that's not your own, which is a very uniquely claustrophobic and lonely existence, really.
Sure.
um, but when you get the moment, like the opportunity to like express yourself as you actually are, and to feel safe to do that, like there's a level of like acceptance and safety that can feel like coming home to a family you didn't know you had. And I think like it takes a certain amount of bravery to be very, out and obvious. But there's a lot of power in that, because there's somebody walking down the street masking some part of their identity, and if they're able to recognize that in you, then maybe they don't feel so alone, and maybe the world doesn't feel as scary and alien all the time. And I think that's kind of one of the most powerful aspects of it, whether it's how you present in public or how you make art or write. Like, there's a lot to be said for representation.
Sure. Well,
As
and not to mention just the overall stress that is involved when we're talking about masking. I was reading a statistic today that was something along the lines of a suicide rate among autistic folks that's something like 9 times the national average. And that's not because there's anything about autism spectrum disorder or these other forms of neurodiversity that increases the propensity for like suicidal ideations or these kinds of things. It's because of the stress and the pressure and the bullying and the trauma that so often goes along with these identities.
Right. I mean, like growing up autistic and ADHD, like there's a lot of negative criticism that come at those kids. So like
Sure.
if you go to school, and I can't remember, it was something like it's like a number like 20 times the criticism like most other kids would get. I don't know where that number was got from. But it's true. It's like you're always bombarded with this idea that you're not quite right, or you feel one way, but you're being told that that's not real or
Mm,
possible. And these things can lead to a lot of negative mental health outcomes, such as anxiety and depression. Like, I know that, gonna get a bit dark for a second.
sure.
I know that I think I first started experiencing like suicidal ideation in elementary school, so probably around like a little bit around or before the age of 8. Um, and that's been, a very common story that I know from a lot of like my trans friends or my other autistic friends. Um, and a lot of it is like there's a template you don't fit, and you're constantly reminded that you don't fit it. But then when you do, if you try to fit it, then nobody knows who you are.
Sure.
So yeah, like it's not a great recipe for good mental health.
So I hate to use the term anti-masking during this bizarre moment in our history, but I mean maybe that's effectively what neuroqueering is like being more thoroughly and fully yourself, leaning into some of these identities, the neurodivergence and the queer identities. Is that maybe a fair way of conceptualizing it?
I would think so. Yeah, like it's kind of like peeling back the layers of that we put on to appear. I don't know. The best word I can think is like is acceptable, and it's one of those things where, like, in some ways, masking is a privilege because some people aren't able to do that. Like non-speaking autistic people, for example, are going to really struggle to pass as neurotypical. And there's like downsides on both sides. But also for a lot of people, it's not safe to unmask as a neurodivergent person. Like neurodivergent people are one of the super high statistics for police shootings because
Hmm,
we don't act in a way that is expected and can frighten people. And when you go to police system, that's all about shoot first, ask later. That's doubly compounded when like the person is Black and autistic. Like that is a hugely like dangerous intersection of identities and would not be safe to unmask the same way as other people can. Like I'm self-employed as someone who takes their clothes off and makes Furbies for a living, and I'm a tiny white woman, so for me, like I appear less threatening, so I have more scope for unmasking than other people do. And so like I recognize the privilege in it and also the power in it to try and make these things seem less foreign and scary and
hmm,
hopefully more accepted and recognized by society. Like if people understand what's going on, then they're less frightened of the people, who are doing that, and hopefully would have a less negative response to people who are different to what they're used to seeing around them.
sure. Well, I'm really entranced by these ideas of intersectionality and how that plays into all of this. When you were here to speak with us about asexuality, and we talked about the ace community and these different things, we acknowledged that there does seem to be a really strong concordance between neurodivergence and asexuality, and probably a handful of other minority sexual orientations. research is still really catching up with all of that. But I feel like this term sort of like squarely places all of those things together. How what can you say about sort of the, I don't know, the Venn diagram of these different identities and why they so often do seem to come bundled?
I mean, like, it's something I think there's been research that has shown that autistic people and neurodivergent people, but I definitely know seen stats for like autistic people. It's something like 2 to 3 times more likely to identify as trans, much more highly likely to identify like as in fact LGBTQ plus in general. And I think like and I think the research also suggests that a lot of it is because like autistic people are less programmed, less I guess like tuned, like hardwired into a lot of these social norms that people kind of just sort of go along with. So are more likely to ask questions like, about their gender or about like their sexuality, like less likely to get caught up in, what's expected, and maybe more likely to start following their own inclinations, whatever they might be.
Yeah, so it might be, at least to a certain extent, the case that folks that are kind of already living in the margins, or who have already
Right.
been sort of forced to break free of convention, are, are just more prepared to maybe own up, or to acknowledge these identities in a lot of ways.
I think also maybe more likely to find people that feel like kin. I've
Mm, sure.
noticed a lot of people who are in some way neurodivergent in like the kink communities, for example, like
Hmm.
like because it can be a sensory seeking thing or a structure thing, like, and also it's all these like just freaks and weirdos. And if you're already
Sure.
been identified as a child as being a freaking weirdo, what you go where the other weirdos are. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but there's a reason why when folks come to a new town and they're like, I don't know how to meet up with like the poly community, for instance, I'm always like, just go to a comic book shop. Like, just find some people who are playing Settlers of Catan or D&D, and you'll get an introduction to that community soon enough.
right, it's like after doing like burlesque and pole dancing, I don't know that I have very many neurotypical friends. Because
Sure.
all the people who are like, you know what, I wanna dress up as Shia LaBeouf and take my clothes off. It takes a special kind of person to come up with that. Hey, ginger snaps. And yeah, and that's again, it's like it's where the weird kids are very much accepted, and it's not that strange in their own little context.
Yeah, well, then I guess the answer then is that not everybody can neuroqueer. If we're taking that as a verb, this is then reserved for certain identities, or I don't want to gatekeep, but who does this apply to? Maybe.
Hang on a second. My computer has become unplugged, and I'm gonna fix that
Oh
because
goodness.
that
Okay.